To establish liability for negligence, the plaintiff must successfully prove 4 distinct elements. These are duty owed by the defendant, breach of that duty, causation linking the breach to the harm, and finally, resulting damages. A plaintiff must satisfy all 4 to win. This video series now pivots entirely to the third element, causation. Causation is notoriously complex because it is not a single question, but rather 2 separate, mandatory components that must both be satisfied in sequence. These 2 components are actual cause, often referred to as cause in fact, and proximate cause, also known as legal cause. We must prove factual connection first, and then policy-based connection second. Our goal moving forward is to master the analysis for both actual cause and proximate cause, as successfully navigating this element is crucial for success on the bar examination. As we established, causation is comprised of 2 distinct hurdles, actual cause and proximate cause. It is absolutely critical to understand that the plaintiff must clear both hurdles sequentially. Think of this process like navigating a mandatory 2-gate security checkpoint. The first gate is actual cause, often called cause in fact. The plaintiff must prove a direct factual link between the defendant's negligent act and the resulting injury. If the plaintiff fails to satisfy the requirements at this first gate, if there is no factual connection, the analysis stops dead right there. The court will never even proceed to examine the second, more complex policy question of proximate cause, or legal cause. Only if the plaintiff successfully passes the factual hurdle of actual cause does the inquiry move forward to determine if the resulting harm was a legally appropriate consequence under the rules of proximate cause. Now that we understand that actual cause, or cause in fact, is the mandatory first hurdle, let us define it precisely. Actual cause establishes the necessary factual link between the defendant's negligent breach and the plaintiff's resulting injury. It is the most basic inquiry. Did the defendant's action actually set the events in motion that led to the harm? To prove this factual connection, the law primarily relies on the but-for test. This test asks a simple, counterfactual question. But for the defendant's breach, would the injury have occurred? If the answer is no, meaning the injury would not have happened without the defendant's specific negligent act, then actual cause is established. Consider a straightforward example. A driver runs a red light, breaching their duty of care, and strikes a pedestrian. But for the driver running the red light, the pedestrian would not have been hit and injured. Because the injury is directly traceable to the breach, the but-for test is satisfied, and we can proceed to the second hurdle. We establish that the but-for test is the primary tool for determining actual cause. However, this test fails when we encounter situations involving concurrent sufficient causes. Imagine 2 independent actors, defendant A and defendant B, both simultaneously start fires that merge downstream, and either fire alone would have been sufficient to burn down the plaintiff's entire house. If we apply the but-for test to defendant A, we ask, but for A's fire, would the house still have burned down? Yes, because B's fire would have done it. The same result occurs for defendant B under a strict but-for analysis. Neither defendant is the actual cause, which is clearly incorrect given they both contributed significantly. To solve this problem, courts employ an alternative standard when the but-for test yields absurd results, the substantial factor test. This test asks whether the defendant's conduct was a substantial factor in bringing about the harm. If the answer is yes, actual cause is satisfied, regardless of the but-for outcome. In our merging fires example, since both A's and B's actions were substantial factors leading to the total destruction, both satisfy the actual cause requirement, and we can proceed to proximate cause. Now that we have successfully navigated actual cause, confirming the factual link between the breach and the injury, we must move to the second, equally crucial hurdle, proximate cause, also known as legal cause. Actual cause deals strictly with what factually happened. Proximate cause, however, is fundamentally different because it is a policy-based limitation. The law recognizes that even if a defendant factually caused the harm, holding them liable for every single resulting consequence, no matter how remote or bizarre, would be unfair and impose an unreasonable burden. Therefore, proximate cause acts as a necessary cutoff point. It asks a forward-looking question. Given the nature of the risk created by the defendant's breach, is it fair and just to hold this specific defendant legally responsible for this specific injury? If the connection is too attenuated, the chain of liability stops here. We establish that actual cause looks backward factually. Proximate cause, conversely, looks forward, focusing entirely on the scope of risk created by the defendant's breach. The central requirement here is foreseeability. For liability to attach, the resulting injury must be a reasonably foreseeable consequence of the defendant's negligent act. If the harm that actually occurred was highly attenuated, bizarre, or completely outside the realm of what a reasonable person would anticipate given the initial breach, the law deems it unforeseeable. When harm is unforeseeable, proximate cause is lacking, and the defendant escapes liability, even if the but-for test was satisfied. Actual cause confirms the factual link. Proximate cause limits liability to the foreseeable consequences flowing from that link. If the resulting injury is too far removed or bizarre, it is simply not proximately caused. We transition now from the abstract concept of foreseeability to the landmark case that defined its application, Palsgraf versus Long Island Railroad Company. This case is crucial for understanding the scope of duty and proximate cause. The facts involve a railroad employee negligently helping a passenger board a moving train, causing the passenger to drop a package. Unbeknownst to the employee, the package contained fireworks, which exploded, knocking over heavy scales far down the platform, injuring Mrs. The majority opinion, written by Justice Cardozo, established the modern rule: liability is limited only to foreseeable plaintiffs. The defendant's duty is confined to those persons within the foreseeable zone of danger created by the negligent act. Since the risk created by pushing the passenger was merely that he might fall, not that fireworks would explode and injure someone far away, Mrs. Palsgraf was outside the zone of danger. The dissent, however, argued for a broader view, suggesting that if you breach a duty to anyone, you owe a duty to all mankind. For the bar exam, remember the majority rule: foreseeability defines the plaintiff. Having established that proximate cause limits liability to the foreseeable zone of danger, we must now address what happens when an event occurs after the defendant's breach but before the plaintiff's ultimate injury. These subsequent events are called intervening causes. The crucial analysis here is whether this intervening event was foreseeable. If the intervening cause is a foreseeable consequence of the initial negligence, such as negligent treatment by emergency medical personnel, it generally does not break the chain of proximate causation. The original defendant remains liable for the resulting harm. However, if the intervening act is extraordinary, independent, and unforeseeable, the law deems it a superseding cause. A superseding cause severs the legal connection between the defendant's breach and the final injury. When a superseding cause exists, the original defendant is relieved of proximate liability, even if actual causation remains intact. Think of it as breaking the chain of legal responsibility. We have now completed the deep dive into causation. Remember, for a plaintiff to succeed, they must clear two distinct hurdles sequentially. First, they must establish actual cause, or cause in fact, using either the but-for test or, in rare cases, the substantial factor test. This establishes the factual link. Second, and only if the first hurdle is cleared, the plaintiff must prove proximate cause, or legal cause. This requires showing the injury was a foreseeable consequence within the zone of danger, unless that chain was broken by an unforeseeable superseding cause. The key takeaway for the bar exam is mastering this distinction. Actual cause deals with factual certainty. Did the breach factually lead to the injury? Proximate cause, however, is entirely policy-based. Is it fair to hold the defendant legally responsible for this specific outcome? Success hinges on recognizing when you are analyzing fact versus when you are analyzing legal policy.